The United Kingdom is set to cut foreign aid in a bid to boost its military budget. The cuts are likely to affect programs dealing with climate change, humanitarian aid and vaccination programs. Some of the countries being funded by the United Kingdom include Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Nigeria and Ethiopia. Now, to discuss this, I'm joined by London correspondent Olly Barratt. Olly, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us this evening. I guess, why is there a need to boost the UK's military budget?
Well, Massa, the UK government says that this is a generational challenge and that the UK needs to, like other European nations, boost its own security. Now, that is something that the UK has been saying for some time. When the new UK government took power in the middle of last year, it said that it wanted to raise the country's defence budget because of what it perceives as rising threats around the world, not least from countries like Russia. But what has happened in recent weeks with the new Trump administration in the White House is twofold. The Americans have been saying to the Europeans, you need to spend more on your own defence and quickly, and the Americans won't always necessarily be there to spend a huge amount of money to protect you in the way that they have previously. We've also seen Donald Trump getting closer to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and that has worried a lot of people in European capitals as well, particularly because there is still a conflict unfolding on European soil in Ukraine. And so for that reason and others, the UK has felt it necessary to significantly boost spending on the military up to 2.5% of GDP by the year 2027. And the way the UK government says it is going to have to fund that is by that cut in international aid.
And some of those programs that it will be cutting as well, Olly, I mean, looking at vaccination programs, climate change programs, humanitarian aid as well, of course, it'll have a dire impact on those countries that are affected. Would you say we're also seeing like a shift here because of what's going on in the US and more developed countries taking a more self-interest approach as opposed to the track record that we had been going on in these globalization years where it seemed that, there was more of a connecting of countries. Now we've gone back to, isolated countries fending for themselves as well.
Certainly that is part of what is at play here. Now, the UK says that this is mostly about making sure that it can pay to defend itself, and it has to find the money from somewhere. And it says it wants to get back to a higher level of spending on international aid in the future, as and when it can. So it hopes that this is not a permanent retreat from spending on international aid. The aid budget for the UK internationally will go down from 0.5% of the country's GDP to 0.3%. So it is a significant cut. It will be worth billions of dollars over a period of years. The UK is trying to slightly distinguish itself from the United States in the way that it's doing this. It's not like Elon Musk and the USAID programs simply immediately pulling funding from projects all over the world. It will be a phased approach. It will try and prioritize some of the funding that it spends in different parts of the world for the people who need it most. And the UK is insisting that that will, as I say, happen over a period of years so that projects will have a little bit of warning if they are no longer going to be funded. But it's very controversial indeed here in the UK. There are a number of Labour MPs from the governing party who are very concerned indeed about this. When they saw the Americans retreating on international spending, they thought the UK should actually step up and fill some of the gap. And they worry that actually that gap will now be filled by countries like China. All of that said, the polling here in the UK shows that the UK public is broadly behind the idea of spending more UK taxpayer money on UK defence and less on international aid projects overseas.
Quite interesting. And also looking at that cut from 0.5% to 0.3%, it was already below what the UN had recommended as a target for aid as well. So if we're going from 0.7% before 2020, and of course COVID-19, also the UK government had to free up budget somewhere to deal with that crisis. But now to go even further down to 0.3% and them saying, well, they're hoping that it's temporary, but the trajectory showing that it's only been getting lower and lower over the years.
That's absolutely right. And the ambition to get to 0.7% was part of the government's plans heading into the last election. They actually criticised the previous government where they cut the aid budget down from 0.7 to 0.5. So it is a tricky issue. And actually today, this has led to the resignation of the development minister, Annelies Dodds. She has quit Keir Starmer's cabinet today, insisting that this is the wrong way to move. She says that actually the extra funding for defence should come from things like extra borrowing and extra taxation rather than cutting spending on international aid. So a headache for the Prime Minister in that regard, and a controversial issue, but the government insisting that at some point it would like to get back up to 0.5 and then 0.7%. But exactly how and when that happens at this point looks very difficult to tell.
Yeah, and we're talking billions of pounds here, Olly.
That's right. I mean, the government was saying when it made this cut that it could fund around £13 billion a year of extra defence spending by making this cut in that cut to aid spending. Now, those numbers have been challenged, but what we can be clear about is that over a period of several years, this will be billions and billions of pounds less in funding to some of these aid projects overseas, which, as critics have been saying, means less money going to projects which help support some of the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, and just looking at some of those countries that will be affected as well from the African continent would be Nigeria, Somalia, Ethiopia and South Sudan. That will have an impact on the entire continent as well.
It'll have an impact on the entire continent. It will have clearly, therefore, an impact on the UK's standing in Africa. It'll have an impact on the UK's relations with some of those countries in Africa where funding is going to be withdrawn. And that's why some critics of this policy here in the UK say that this is a short-sighted approach, because they have believed for a long time that the UK's standing as a major international aid donor is a hugely beneficial one when it comes to soft power. Now, the government says in response to that actually the UK will remain one of the biggest international aid donors on earth, but clearly it is slipping down those rankings rather than upwards, and that's one of the reasons that this is such a thorny issue for the government, which is seeing it take such criticism. All of that said, as I say, the polls suggest the British people are really on board in a broad sense with this policy. We also actually are seeing the opposition Conservatives saying that they agree with the policy as well, that they also believe that this is the right way to find extra funding for military spending at a time when the geopolitical situation in the world, but particularly in Europe, is so precarious. So while it is controversial and while there's huge opposition to it, and while campaign groups and charities say they are aghast at this move, there is also some support for it here in the UK too, despite the difficulties that it may well cause in terms of the UK's standing in relationships on the African continent and others.
Yeah. Now, Olly, before I let you go as well, today was quite a manic day with some of the UK's major banks just being down and customers in a frenzy trying to access their funds on payday. Tell us a little bit about these banks that were found themselves in this predicament.
That's right, it is payday for millions of people in the UK, and that is obviously just about the worst day for banking apps and online banking systems to go down. And what we saw was that a series of financial institutions, many of them under the umbrella of the Lloyds banking group, were seeing these problems where people couldn't log into their accounts. They therefore couldn't see, for example, if their paycheck had been deposited or not. They had problems making online payments. So a lot of customers were saying, look, I don't know if my salary is even in there. I can't then move part of that salary to pay my mortgage if that's the way I do it, or to pay credit card bills, or to pay someone to whom I owe money. I might miss a payment, therefore I might be incurring late fees as a result. So huge disruption for many customers. TSB, which is one of the banks affected, said that we apologise for this and we're working hard to resolve it. Nationwide, which is a building society, says they'd identified an issue that was causing a delay to some incoming and outgoing payments. They said that payments were being queued and were still being processed, and they advised customers not to, for example, try and make payments twice and therefore see more money than they were intending go out of their bank accounts. This is not an uncommon issue in recent times. Barclays have had problems on payday in the recent months as well. UK MPs have been writing to financial institutions asking them for an explanation as to why this seems to be happening with more regularity. And it's also caused more debate about whether banks are right to withdraw some of their high street operations to move customers online and away from cash if they can't necessarily keep up with demand on busy days like payday for their apps and their online banking systems.
Sounds like quite the frenzy. Olly, thank you so much for joining us and your time and insights. That's Olly Barratt, who's a London correspondent.